If you're a beginner who's just getting into interior design, there are 5 concepts you absolutely need to know, starting with number 1, the rule of 3. So if you've ever looked at your shelf, coffee table, or fireplace mantle and felt like it just looked like a random pile of clutter, you might be overlooking the rule of 3. And this is a super important trick in interior design because once you understand it, you'll never look at your furniture the same way again. And the concept is incredibly simple. To make a space look professionally designed, you have to stop thinking in pairs and start thinking in odd numbers, specifically groups of 3. Because when we see identical items, our brains immediately think they look like a set that was just picked up from a big box store. And this feels boring and stiff. But when you have 3 items grouped together, it suddenly looks like a style. It creates a little arrangement that feels more natural, more creative, and just more interesting to look at. But you don't need to be an artist to get this right. You just need to remember that 3 is the magic number for making any surface in your home look intentional. And so the easiest way to master this rule without overthinking it is to use this simple formula. 1 tall, 1 medium, 1 small. So think of it like a family photo where everyone's standing at a different height to make the picture look balanced. So when you're gathering items for a table, you want 1 tall item that acts as your anchor. And so this could be a tall vase with some branches, a slim table lamp, or a large pillar candle. And this is important because this tall item is going to reach up into the empty air above your furniture and catch your eye from across the room, which prevents the entire area from looking flat. Next, you need a medium item, and this will generally sit around half as high as your tall one. And so this could be a stack of a couple books, a smaller vase, or something like a framed photo. And this piece acts as a bridge, which connects that tall anchor to its surroundings so it doesn't look like it's standing alone in a desert. And then finally, you add a small item like a little brass paperweight, a low ceramic bowl, or some kind of a decorative tray. And this is the detail that rewards you for coming closer, which makes the whole setup feel personal and human rather than just a cold display of objects. But the most important part of the process is how you actually place these 3 items wherever they are in your home. Because the biggest mistake people make is lining up their decor in a straight line like a bunch of soldiers. Because when you line things up like this, it looks like a retail shelf or a marching band, which again feels stiff and unnatural. So instead, you want to cluster them together so they're almost touching or slightly overlapping. So imagine you're drawing a small triangle on your table and you place your 3 items at the 3 points of the triangle. You put the tallest item in the back corner and you pull the medium and small items slightly forward and toward the center. This creates a little visual moment that feels like a single beautiful decoration instead of 3 separate lonely objects. And it also guides the eye in a gentle, rhythmic sort of pattern from top to bottom and makes the arrangement as a whole feel like a curated piece of art. Now, as you get more comfortable with this, you'll realize that this rule isn't just for the small spots in your home. Because if you have a larger surface, like a long dining table or a wide entryway console, then a group of 3 might look a little lost. So in those cases, you just step up through the odd numbers and move to 5 items or even up to 7 if the space warrants it. But the goal remains the same. You want to avoid symmetry and keep the heights varied. And by sticking to these odd numbered clusters of 3, 5, or 7, you prevent your home from looking like a showroom and start making it feel like a curated sanctuary. It's a low effort, high reward habit that makes your space look expensive and thoughtful, even if the items you're using are just things you already had lying around the house. And by the way, if you want to see how your own home would look after making some of the changes I'm talking about, I've developed some tools to help you with exactly that. For example, if you're on a budget and only want to upgrade the lighting in your home, one of my tools will show you exactly how to go from a kitchen that looks harsh and overly sterile like this one, to one that looks cozy and inviting like this, just by changing the lighting. Of course, the tools can do way more than that, but I just wanted to give you a very small sneak peek now, so if you want to get full access to them, check out the link in the description. Now, choosing the right colors for a room is one part of the design process that makes people really nervous. And so you either end up with a space where everything is the exact same shade of oatmeal, which just feels like living inside of a cardboard box, or you end up with a chaotic explosion of colors that makes the room feel restless and messy. So to fix this, some designers use what's known as the 60-30-10 rule. But before you run off thinking you need a calculator to make this work, you don't. You just need to understand that a well-designed room has a hierarchy. And you can think of it like a well-balanced meal. If every ingredient is trying to be the main flavor, then the whole dish becomes a disaster. Instead, you need a base flavor, a supporting flavor, and a little bit of seasoning to make it just right. And in the same way, the 60-30-10 rule gives your eyes a clear set of instructions on where to look first, second, and third. So the first and biggest piece is the 60%, which is your dominant color. And you can think of this as the canvas or the background of your entire room. And because this 60% takes up the most visual space, this will generally be the color of your walls, though if you're in the kitchen, it could also be the color of your cabinets. And so a lot of homes keep this most dominant color neutral and soft, like a warm cream, a soft gray, or a light tan, but you certainly don't have to. You could also go bold with a deep forest green or a moody navy, as long as you commit to it across those large surfaces. You just want to remember that this color sets the overall temperature of the room, and by keeping these largest surfaces consistent, you're creating a stable foundation that allows the rest of the room to actually shine. Next, you have your 30%, which is your secondary color. And so if the 60% is the star, then the 30% is the supporting actor. And since you're going to use this color about half as much as your main color, it typically comes through in things like curtains, pieces of furniture, bedding, and maybe even a painted accent wall. And the secret to making it work is contrast. So if your main color is a light and airy white, then your secondary color should be something different enough to create a bit of meat in the design. So something like a rich wood tone, a deep burnt orange, or a dusty olive green. This is the layer that prevents your room from feeling flat or boring, and it adds a specific character and personality to your home. Because without this 30% layer, your room ends up looking like a room in a box that you bought from a furniture store, where everything is just too perfectly matched and lacks any real soul. And then finally, you have the last 10%, which is your accent color. And you can think of this as the jewelry of the room, and it's where you get to have the most fun. Because this color only represents a tiny fraction of the space, you can afford to be bold and use vibrant, high contrast colors that you might be too scared to use on a whole wall. So you'll generally find that this 10% shows up on items like throw pillows, pieces of artwork, ceramics, and things like lamps. So if your room is mostly neutral and navy, then maybe your accent color is a pop of bright mustard yellow or an eye-catching red. Because this little visual spike is what keeps the brain engaged and gives that designer touch that makes a room feel finished and high-end. And by the way, to make the 10% accent color look like a deliberate choice rather than a random accident, you just need to use the 3-point anchor trick. So if you pick a bold color for a pillow, don't just leave it as one single item, or it's going to look like it doesn't belong. Instead, you want to repeat that same color in at least 3 different spots around the room. So for example, you might have that yellow pillow on the sofa, a hint of yellow in a painting on the wall, and an outward-facing yellow book on your bookshelf. This creates a visual thread that leads the eye naturally from one side of the room to the other and makes the whole design feel like a cohesive story. Now, another one of the most common mistakes people make when designing their homes is hanging their artwork too high. I mean, there's no better way to ruin a beautiful painting than to float it so high up that it looks like it's trying to fly out of the room. Because when your art is hung too high, it creates this uncomfortable gap between your furniture and the art, which just makes the whole room feel disjointed and cold. And this happens because most people try to center the art on the wall itself, but that's the wrong way to do it. Fortunately, there is an easy way to fix this, and it's by applying the 57-inch rule. Now, first off, where on earth does 57 inches come from, right? I mean, it just feels like such a random number. Well, it's 57 inches because this is the universal standard used by art galleries and museums worldwide. And to be more specific, this means that the center of your artwork, so not the top or the bottom, but the center of the piece should be exactly 57 inches from the floor. And it's 57 inches because this represents the average human eye level. So this places the artwork exactly where your gaze naturally lands when you walk into a room, so you don't have to crane your neck up or strain to see the details because the art is positioned to greet you at your own level. But since we don't live in museums with white walls and zero seating, there are a few situations where you can change this up just a little bit. The first is in living or dining rooms where you spend most of your time sitting down. Here, you can actually go a few inches lower because then the art will be closer to eye level when you're seated. Now, don't lower it all the way down to eye level when you're seated, or your place is going to look like it was built for Oompa Loompas. But something like 54 or 55 inches instead of 57 inches is fine. The goal is to keep the conversation between you and the artwork as intimate as possible. So if the art feels too high when you're lounging on the sofa, you can bring it down a little bit to make your living room feel more like a cozy private alcove. And then the second situation where you can change this up is when you're hanging art directly above a piece of furniture, like a sofa, your bed, or a console table. In these scenarios, the relationship between the art and the furniture is actually more important than the relationship between the art and the floor. And so to prevent the art from feeling like it's floating, you want the bottom of the frame to sit about 6 to 10 inches above the top of the furniture. Because when that gap is too large, your eye perceives two separate disconnected objects, so a stray sofa and a stray painting. But when they're placed within that 6 to 10 inch sweet spot, they merge into a single powerful focal point. In that case, the furniture acts as a pedestal for the art, and the art provides the crown for the furniture, which makes the entire arrangement feel well curated. And once you start applying this, hanging art stops being guesswork and just starts feeling obvious. You're no longer asking, does this look centered on the wall? You're really just asking, does this feel right to the people who spend time in this room? Because when art sits at the right height, it quietly pulls your space together. The furniture feels grounded, the wall feels finished, and the room suddenly feels calmer, warmer, and more put together, even if nothing else changes. Now, when a lot of people want to make a room feel special or exciting, their first instinct is usually to go shopping for patterns. You look for a rug with a big geometric print, some floral throw pillows, or maybe some striped wallpaper for that accent wall. And while there's nothing wrong with a well-chosen wallpaper, patterns are inherently loud, and they fight for your attention the moment you walk in. And if you fill a room with too many different patterns, the space starts to feel like it's shouting at you from every corner, making it feel frantic and busy even when it's perfectly clean. And that's why the real secret to a home that feels expensive, calm, and sophisticated isn't adding more patterns, it's choosing texture over pattern. Now, to understand why this works, you have to think about how your eyes feel a room, because texture provides what designers call quiet depth. It's the difference between a room looking like a flat, two-dimensional photo and a space that feels like it has a real soul. Because when everything in a room has the same smooth, factory-finished surface, and you can think of a shiny leather sofa, a glass coffee table, and flat silk curtains for this, the room ends up feeling plastic and sterile, like a hotel lobby where you aren't allowed to touch anything. But by focusing on texture, you create richness through variety rather than complexity. Because texture is about how light hits a surface and how your hand feels when it brushes against a fabric. So the way to create this richness is by intentionally picking materials that have a different hand feel and letting them live right next to each other. And so the key is pairing opposites to create a visual rhythm that keeps your eyes moving without tiring them out. So think about rough versus smooth for a second. If you have a sleek, polished leather armchair, don't put a smooth silk pillow on it. Instead, you want to drape a chunky, nubby wool blanket over the side, because the roughness of the wool makes the smoothness of the leather look more intentional and high-end. Or think about matte versus shiny. That's why you'd place an earthy ceramic vase on a glossy marble tray. The way the light soaks into the matte ceramic compared to how it bounces off the shiny tray creates a layer of depth that a printed pattern can never achieve. And this strategy works because patterns are essentially visual noise. They're a loud instruction for your brain to keep track of a specific shape. But texture, on the other hand, adds visual weight without the noise. So, for example, imagine a plain white pillow versus a white pillow with a heavy cable knit weave. They're the same color, but the knitted one feels heavy and significant. It draws you in for a closer look, it makes you want to touch it, but it doesn't make the room feel messy. And you can even apply this to your floors. Instead of hunting for a busy rug with a complicated design to fill up a room, try looking for a heavy jute or seagrass rug with a deeper weave. Because when you set a soft velvet sofa on top of that rough, earthy rug, you've created a sensory experience that feels really well grounded. And if you do it right, incorporating texture can make your home timeless, because a trendy pattern often becomes dated in just a few years, but the materials themselves, like wood, wool, stone, and linen, these never go out of style. And so by layering these different feelings, you're building a space that leverages the quality and variety of materials to make it feel like home. Now, the final concept that differentiates professional designers from beginners is an understanding of negative space. Because when most people start designing their homes, they look at an empty corner, a bare wall, or a clear tabletop, and they see a problem that needs to be solved. And there's this almost frantic urge to fill that space because we've been conditioned to believe that more stuff equals more style. But if you fill every single inch of a room with furniture and decor, your space will feel claustrophobic and overwhelming, even if every item is beautiful on its own. So the secret to a home that feels truly high-end isn't just about what you put in the room, it's also about the space you intentionally leave empty. And to understand why this works, you need to realize that your brain needs a place to rest. And if it helps, you can think of your room like a piece of music. If every second is filled with loud, crashing notes, it wouldn't be a song, it would just be noise. So you need the silence between the notes to make the melody actually mean something. And in interior design, that silence is negative space. It's the visual low that allows the highs, like your beautiful sofa or that piece of art you just hung 57 inches off the ground. It allows those to stand out. Because when you crowd a hero piece with too many other items, you muffle its voice. But when you give it some breathing room, you give it permission to be the main character in the room. And to be honest, the reason a lot of homes feel cluttered, even when they're tidy, is because they lack this kind of visual relief. For example, if you have a gallery wall filled with photos, you probably don't need a shelf full of knickknacks right next to it. And if you have a visually heavy coffee table, you don't need a rug with a busy pattern underneath it. But by intentionally leaving a wall bare or a corner empty, you create a path for the eye to travel on. It tells you there's nothing to see here, so keep your eyes moving toward the window. In other words, negative space acts as the frame for the rest of your room. And it makes your space feel organized, sophisticated, and really well curated. Fortunately, you can dig into this right now by doing a room audit. So to do it, just walk into your kitchen or living room and look for the hot spots, the area where there's just too much going on. So maybe your fireplace mantle is covered in 20 tiny photos, or maybe your kitchen counters are just hidden under a bunch of random stuff. So try removing a few things and just let the surface breathe for a day or two. You might feel the itch to put something back because the space feels empty, but give it some time. Eventually, your brain will stop seeing that emptiness as a missing piece and start seeing it as a luxury, a sense of calm that lowers your heart rate when you walk through the door. But if I'm being honest, mastering negative space comes down to confidence. Because it takes confidence to leave that wall blank or to leave the shelf half empty, because it shows that you trust the pieces you have chosen to do the heavy lifting for the room. But by embracing negative space, you stop designing out of fear and start designing with a sense of purpose. Now, the reason all these concepts feel like cheat codes is because they all solve the same invisible problem, which is that most homes don't look unfinished because they're missing pieces. They look unfinished because the relationships between the pieces they already have aren't clear. But once you internalize the 5 ideas I just shared with you, that all changes because you can see your mistakes before they become permanent fixtures of your space. But for me, the deeper takeaway is that design is less about some inherent understanding of taste and more about developing an understanding of the foundational principles behind every great space. So watch this video next to dive deeper into those principles and get the simple framework that turns these cheat codes into a repeatable system you can use to make any room look beautiful.